Okay. So if you do have any other questions, let me know. I can always pause or review something. But for now, we're just going to add in some physics and just kind of see what happens, and go over some of the things that we need to set up to make sure our physics works well. So I'm going to open up one of my scenes. I think I'll start with level 1, just because it's pretty simple, and so it'll be a good place to start. And so we've been using a lot of physics, basically to make anything work. We kind of have to use a lot of the default physics, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail about what's actually happening with our physics, and we're going to add some more physics bodies. So right now, in this really simple scene, we have a few basic colliders, we have a few basic different types of physics bodies. And what I want to review, which is very important for a minute, is the collision, layer, and mask properties that most of our physics bodies work with. Using the layer and mask makes the game run a lot better. It helps the performance of the game, and it also makes our scripting a lot easier, because we don't have to spend as much time basically checking as many things in the scene as we normally would. So I'll show you a quick example. Right now in our scene, I'm just going to turn these trees off for a second so we can just focus. Right now we basically have two main components that make up this scene. We have our player, which is its own little sub-scene, and our player is a character body, which is a specific types of physics body. And when we look at rigid bodies, the difference between the character body and the rigid body will be a lot more clear, but we haven't seen those yet. And then we just have the ground, which is a static body that obviously the player stands on. And so if we look at the player for a second, we can look at the code for the player. And here, if I right click on character body 3D and go to look up symbol, so we can see the documentation from Godot, and we can see that this character body 3D inherits from the physics body class, which inherits from the collision object, which inherits from the node 3D, which inherits from node, which inherits from object. And so all of these properties of these different types of objects are all collected into the character body 3D, along with the properties and things that the character body 3D can do on its own. And the character body is new to Godot 4. It kind of incorporates a lot of the physics that are usually used with either player characters or NPC characters. And the main difference is that you want to be able to control the character, but you don't want it to fall down, essentially. So when we look at rigid body physics, it kind of reacts to a lot of different things that are happening in the scene. And to manage all that stuff with our code is a little bit too much to do. So the character body basically keeps our characters standing upright. So they still interact with other objects in the scene, but they don't just fall over if they're just standing there. That's kind of the main difference, but there's some other properties that are involved here. But if we look at the physics body 3D, we'll see sort of the main things that physics bodies can do. And if we look at collision object, that's an even, sort of more general type of object, where the collision object, we've talked a lot about collisions versus meshes. Collisions basically are when two objects are in the same space. So our physics body has a bunch of properties like here we see kinematic collision 3D. And so kinematic basically means moving. Kinematics generally refers to the physics of describing movement between objects or bodies. And so things like move and collide will add forces to our physics body. If we look at, we can see that physics body is inherited by a few different types. There's the character body 3D, which we were just looking at. Then there's the static body, which we've used for the ground. And then there's the rigid body 3D, which we're going to look at today. So the rigid body 3D has a lot more properties that we can use to make it, interact with the physics in the world. So there's things like the mass, or how much it weighs. There's things like inertia, and there's center of mass and force. There's all these different physics forces that we can use to make these objects move. And they have some default forces as well. So all of that stuff is in here. There's like a lot of attributes, and many of them are exposed to the editor. So we'll take a look at that as well. So let's go back into our level for a second, and I just want to demonstrate one quick thing. So inside the player, in the character body 3D section right here, we see there's this collision section. And the collision section has two parts. One is the layer, and one is the mask. And this is the thing that is often very confusing, and even I make mistakes on this all the time. But basically, the layer is describing what this object is on, essentially. And then the mask describes what it can interact with. And so they all default to 1. So if you just leave 1 as the defaults for all of them, then all of the objects will be basically looking to interact with one another, which is fine. But as we add more objects into our scene, the complexity makes the performance of the scene worse. But it also makes programming more challenging, because if we're programming specific interactions, we have to check to make sure that we want the things to interact. But if we set our layers and our masks correctly, we don't have to do that. We can just assume that if two things are interacting, that they are supposed to be interacting. So the thing that we can do to make this easier is edit our layer names. So you can see I've already added a few layers here. We have our player, our platforms, and our collectible. And we can add, and we'll add more layers in the future. And so we can see, I haven't really set this up. So if I click on the player layer is right. It should be here. But the mask is wrong. The player does not need to mask for itself, because the player doesn't interact with itself. So I should just turn this off. But we do want the player to interact with the platforms, and I'll show you why. So if we look at our ground for a second, I'm going to open up the collision. Our ground is also just on the default layer 1, mask 1. And so our player and our ground are set to interact with each other. But if I turn these off and I run the scene, you'll see what happens is they don't collide. So they just fall through each other. And that, in general, is a good quality, because we don't want, if two things are not supposed to interact, we don't want to have to check to see if they are interacting. So what we can do, if we put the ground on the second layer, which is our platforms layer, and we look for the player by clicking on mask, now we will have, the interaction. I might have skipped one part. Oh, and we have to have the player look for the platforms. So let's do that again. So now our player is looking for our platforms, and our ground is looking for our player. And so now we get this interaction. If the ground is not on layer 2, then the player won't be able to find it. And likewise, if our ground is not looking for layer 1, in that case, actually it works. So it's a little bit tricky. So our player is looking for layer 2. Let's see if we can, what's the minimal version of this? So if our player is looking for layer 2 and our ground is on layer 2, then we get the interaction. Let's see what happens if we reverse this. Sometimes I forget. So our player is on layer 1 and our ground is looking for layer 1. Let's see if that works. Okay, so that does not work. So there may be some hierarchy. Let's Google this real quick. So let's say Godot layer, mask, character, body, and static body. Okay. Okay, this is just a lot of people who are not able to get it right, like we are. Let's see if it tells us in here. Okay, this doesn't tell us specifically, but we'll do some more research later and we'll come back. But we figured out through trial and error that our player does have to look for our ground. So if our ground is on layer 2, then our player has to mask for layer 2. And so now we still fall through. Okay. Oh, I took the ground off layer 2. Okay. So our ground is on layer 2, our player looks for layer 2, and now our player stands on the ground. Okay, so let's add some other objects into the scene, and we'll add some more physics and some more collisions and layers. So I'm going to build this object here, but then I'll probably move it to another scene at some point. So we're going to add a rigid body, and so we're going to see the difference between the rigid body and the character body. The character body only moves when we apply forces to it through code, but our rigid bodies will move on their own. They have their own physics. So I'm going to click the plus button here and type in rigid body. And the rigid body, again, is also different from the static body. The static body is never going to move unless we add some code to say, change the position or something like that. So for our rigid body 3D, we need to give it a collision shape. And to be able to see it, we need to give it a mesh. So keep in mind that our mesh and our collision shape, they don't have to be the same. So if I want to use my apple mesh for my rigid body, I can do that. So let's add a couple primitives, and then we'll add the apple in a second. So first I'm going to add a mesh, and then I'm going to add a collision shape. So for our mesh, let's do a cube or a box, and for our collision shape, let's also do a box, and the default should be the same size. So when I start to edit this, remember, I don't want to move the mesh or the cube. What I want to move is the parent to both of them, the rigid body. If I move them so they're in different places or start to edit them in that way, then our collisions are going to look kind of funky. So I'm going to move this up here, and so now we see our mesh.
Question about that, because it has happened to me before.
Yeah.
When I edit the collision box on its own, I mean, in my mind, it doesn't matter. It should keep working. The mesh should keep working, and the collision box too.
Yeah.
One on its each one of it on its own.
It does,
but
yeah.
When I do that, I get this alert.
Oh, really?
They stop working. The collision doesn't work anymore.
So if your mesh and your collision are not the same shape or they're not in the same place, they'll still work. The difference may be if you have one that's parented to the other. So for example, if my collision shape is parented to my mesh, then it's not recognized by the physics body, and that's when I'll get an error.
So they both should be on the body.
They should both be on the body. But you can actually parent the mesh to the collision shape. That's fine. The main issue here is that the collision shape has to be directly under the physics body, because that's where the physics body expects it to be. Yeah. That's the only thing that really matters, but I like to generally organize it like this. Yeah. Okay, so we've got our box here. And so let's give this a quick material. So I'm just going to throw one of my default materials on here just so we can see it a little bit better. I'll put my blue grid material on here. Let's throw a green grid on the ground while we're here. Okay. And so now we've got a box, and this is a rigid body. So if we run this scene, we'll see that it's going to fall to the ground. Or maybe it's not. Or maybe it's on my head. If I move. Oh, no, it's still there. Okay. Well, it should fall. Let's see. Maybe we need to check the settings. Let's see. I think it's because it's like inside the player body. So maybe if I just move it over here a little bit, we'll see it fall. There we go. Okay. But notice it falls through the ground because we changed the masks and the layers for the ground. So let's fix that real quick. So remember, our ground is on layer 2. And right now it's not really looking for anything. Our player lands on the ground because the player is looking for the ground. So for our rigid body, we can create a new layer. Let's just make a new layer here. And eventually we're going to pick these up. So we'll call this the pickable layer. And then we'll add some more layers later if we need it. This is just an example. You don't necessarily need to use this specific layer or the specific name. It's just for the demo. So now I'll switch this rigid body to layer 4 and take it off layer 1. So most of the objects are only going to be on one layer. You can put an object on multiple layers. There may be examples where you need objects that interact with 2 different parts of the scene. So like if you have enemies that can, act in different contexts, you might have multiple layers. But most of the time, your objects will only be on one layer, but they may interact with multiple layers. So let's mask the platforms. And so now our box will hit the ground when it falls. Okay, so that's not very exciting, but it is working. Let's rotate it a little bit so we can see that it actually interacts based on the collision shape. So you can see it hits that edge and then falls over. And then if we walk up to the box, notice that I just passed through the box, even though I have a character body. That is because the box and the player are not looking for each other. So we can fix that. We can click on our mask for our box and make it look for the player. And now if I run this, when I hit the box, it should move. And so now we can see we can kind of move the box just by hitting it. So you may or may not want that to be the case. If you don't want that to be the case, just turn that mask off. If you do want that to be the case, then, leave it on. And we should be able to jump on the box and, although I don't know if I can get high enough. I can't quite get high enough. Okay, now I'm on the box. Or maybe I'm not. It's kind of hard to tell. Let's turn up my jump height a little bit. Okay, now if I get on the box, it kind of just like moves. It's probably because the bottom of my player is a capsule shape, so it's like probably pushing down the edge of the box. If I made the box really wide, maybe that would change. So let's see if we can do that actually as an example. So as we talked about a second ago, when we edit this, we don't want to scale. We never want to scale. Always remember, do not scale. You can scale, but it's just easier if you don't. But we want to change the size of this. So we need to change the size of the mesh and our collision. Okay, so if we just change the size of the mesh, it'll look weird. So if I go to my mesh and let's just make it a little bit wider. So let's make it 4 by 4. Okay, and let's drag it up a little bit. So notice, even though I've changed the mesh, it looks weird because it still has the box collider. And so I can like walk through the side of the mesh now because the box and the mesh and the collider don't match. So we can go to our collision shape, click on the box, and we can set that to the same. And the nice thing is in Godot 4, these units are the same. You used to do the extent, so it would be half. You can also change the size using these red dots, but we don't want to use these guys. We don't want to actually move our collision or our mesh around. We only want to change the transform of the parent rigid body. Okay, so now that it's bigger, let's see if we can stand on it. No. Okay. That may be a little too much for our physics solver. Yeah, so we're kind of like pushing it through the ground, I think. Let's see if we... Yeah, we're pushing it through the ground. So our ground maybe is a little too thin. There's, you know, you can play around with the physics. You'll find that there are these thresholds that it'll break through. There are a lot of properties that we can change that may affect this. So for example, with our rigid body, we can change the mass. If I make the mass really, really low, it may or may not have an effect on this. That's basically the same. If I make the mass really high, the highest is 1,000 kg. It's pretty much the same, but it'll probably be harder for me to push the box if the mass is really high. No, it pretty much looks the same. It may be a little heavier. It's kind of hard to tell. Okay, but we can still push it around. But there's other things that we can change. We can set, for example, like the angular velocity. We can damp the velocity a lot. So if we set the damp to like 5, it's not going to rotate as fast. So it'll move, but it's not going to rotate as much. So we really have a lot of control over all of these different forces. We can also lock the axis in some places. So I could lock, let's lock the y-axis. And so you see it's stuck in the air. So it can't move on the x and y, or on the y. But if I leave the y on and lock the x, you'll see that it still falls, and we can move it, but it's not gonna move if I try to move it this way. So it can only move in one direction now. Okay, so you can really have a lot of control over all of these different properties. You can also just freeze it completely. So where's that? Yeah, so in deactivation. So if we freeze this, it won't react to physics. And so you can do that in the code if you want to one of your objects to not react to physics and then start reacting to physics again. So you can do that as well. Okay, so let's add some more boxes. I'm just going to call this box. And I'm going to set this back to the default 1 by 1. So I'm going to duplicate this a couple times, and let's see if they interact with each other. So I'll put one like that, and I'll put another one like that. So we're going to notice that right now they don't interact with each other, because again, they're not looking for each other. So our default box is only interacting with the player and the platforms. It doesn't interact with other pickable objects. So instead of duplicating these, because we're not going to be able to edit them all at the same time, let's make an instance. So I'm going to right click on here and say save branch to scene. And I'll go into scenes and components, and I'll just save this as box. So now on this box, if I go into the scene and I go to collision, I can say I want the box to look for other boxes. So now if I duplicate this a few times and run my scene, you'll see that the boxes can stack up on each other, and they interact with each other. And again, if we change the mass and do all sorts of different stuff, it's going to affect the way that they interact with each other. And so you can start to, if you want to use physics in your scene, we can start to add stuff together. Okay, now I can kind of maybe stand on here. No, I just kind of squish them. I think if you wanted your player to stand, you might want to use a cylinder collider, or there might be like some other code way to do it. Okay, So then obviously these interactions change if you use other types of colliders. So if we add another rigid body, and I'll add a mesh and add a collision shape. So for this one, I'll do a sphere. And same here. And I'll throw this guy above these guys as well. And let's throw a material on there. So we'll see that the sphere, I think it just, it gained too much force. Let's turn the mass on the sphere down. Okay, so let's see. So the sphere still gains a lot of mass and then falls through our ground. We may need to make our ground a little bit wider. Or taller, I guess, is what I mean. Oh, it's locked. Okay. I should just put it at -5. Whoops, -5. Or I guess it's a little lower than that. What did I set it to? Okay. And it still goes through. Okay, let's put our sphere somewhere else. We're getting a little bit too much force. So I'll bring it down here. Oh, I didn't. Oh, okay. This is a good example of forgetting to set your collision masks. So our sphere, let's put that on the pickable layer. And let's interact with the player and the platforms and other pickables. So now our sphere interacts. And if we hit the sphere, see, it's gonna roll because it's round. And it's probably gonna roll right off of our ground. But it'll obviously interact with the boxes using those different collisions. Okay, so we've gone over layers of mass. We've gone over some of the different types of physics bodies. We made a little scene with our boxes. I'm trying to think if there's anything else we need to demo before we take a break for a minute. I think that's pretty much it, actually. Obviously, there's a lot of physics properties you can play around with. I think for this, you can just, work on this and see what you can do if you have ideas for stuff that you want to do with this. And yeah, there's a lot of different things you could try with the physics. So I think we'll just stop here and just do some workshop time. And then later in class, what we're going to go over is some scripting for our player to be able to pick up the objects and then, drop them or throw them. So that'll give us a little bit more control over components in our scene. So yeah, that's what we'll do next. Any questions or anything you guys want to look at now?
Just a quick question. I know you can paint weights in Blender.
Mm-hmm.
You can literally paint how much does it weigh in each zone of the 3D model.
Yeah.
Does it have any impact? Is it reflected on how it behaves in Godot, or it's just treated as a mass?
So are you talking about weight painting for for rigging or? Yeah. So that is not really related to the physics system. What that does is it changes. So for when you're rigging something, you have a skeleton, and the skeleton deforms the mesh based on your movement or animation. And what the weight painting does is it changes how much influence that bone has over that area of the mesh. So weight doesn't really mean like mass.
Okay.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with
Yeah.
physics in Godot
Yeah.
or Unreal Engine.
It's a little bit of a different system, but you can change the mass distribution. So for example, I don't know if it'll still be easy to demonstrate, but if I take like here, I'll just make another rigid body. Okay, so for this one, let's make a big rectangle again. So I'll make this like 10 by 2. Yeah, I think that's fine. So 10 by 2. And then we'll move this over here and up here. And so if we change the center of mass on this, by default, it's just going to fall just like everything else falls. Let's put our collisions on it. But if we change our mass distribution, we can set the center of the mass. So if we move it over a little bit on X, and then we run this again, one side is going to weigh a bit more. We didn't really see it. We could probably put something under it to show that, but let me, you can just mask the player and then, okay. I need to get it away from the, okay, let's see if I can. It's not really, it's hard to see. But it should, like when I hit it, it should sort of like weight towards one direction. Yeah, you can kind of see it doing it there. I might need to do it more dramatically. But yeah, so you can offset the weight, the center of mass, and that'll kind of change how it behaves. But yeah, that's the basic idea.
Okay.
Uh,
Sorry about that.
oh, no, that's fine. We can also change the gravity. I didn't really think about that either, but we could set the gravity really low. Or actually, it looks like you can do negative gravity, so it's going to fall out. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff you could play with to kind of, do different stuff. Okay, I'm going to stop here.